filmmaking today, I guess, is the most conservative art form.
Next to music, I think, probably.
Maybe. Maybe
the man giving his thoughts on the film industry to David Bowie here is Danish filmmaker Thomas Vinterberg, and it's this characterisation of it as conservative and conformist that led him, along with fellow countryman and filmmaker Lars von Trier, to found the Dogma 95 movement, which, amongst other things, forbade film scoring in their films.
Ask most filmmakers what music means to their films, and whilst you'll get a variety of answers, most remain broadly positive as to the role of film music overall in their work.
Martin Scorsese said that music and film are almost one and the same. Hitchcock said that music makes it possible to express the unspoken in film.
Dogma 95 undercuts this assumption, not only discouraging, but outright prohibiting film scoring. Before we look at how music manifested itself in the Dogma films, let's take a brief look at what Dogma 95 actually is. If you already know this, then skip to the time shown on screen now to get straight into the analysis.
On March 13th, 1995, Danish directors Thomas Vinterberg and Lars von Trier sat down and created this, the Dogma 95 manifesto, or as they called it in a characteristically tongue-in-cheek manner, the vow of chastity. The manifesto is made up of 10 rules, alongside a small pledge at the end. The 10 rules read as follows. Shooting must be done on location, and props and sets must not be brought in. The rule that we're interested in this video, that sound must never be produced apart from the images, or vice versa. Music must not be used unless it occurs where the scene is being shot. The camera must be handheld. Any movement within this is permissible. The film must be in colour, and special lighting is not acceptable. Optical work and filters are forbidden. The film must not contain superficial action like murders or weapons. Temporal and geographical alienation are forbidden, or more simply, the film must take place here and now. Genre movies are not acceptable. The film must be in Academy 35mm, and lastly, the symbolic and to most people most shocking rule that the director must not be credited. The rules are followed by a short pledge which states that I swear as the director to refrain from personal taste, I am no longer an artist.
That, in short, is what Dogma 95 is. If you've already forgotten half of these rules, it doesn't really matter, since Rule 2, the no music rule, is the one we're going to be taking a deep dive into today, since this is a music channel, not a film channel.
Because the visual aspects are so interesting, the sound of Dogma films has been comparatively understudied. And calling it a no music rule isn't exactly true, since the rule doesn't actually forbid music.
It forbids sound from being produced apart from the image. This eliminates the possibility of any non-diegetic music, or music that doesn't exist within the universe of the film, like background music or a film score.
It still permits diegetic music, music that does exist within the film's universe, so it allows for characters to sing, play instruments, or do things like listen to the radio within the world of the film. Throughout this video, I'll be illustrating a lot of what I say with examples from Thomas Vinterberg's 1998 film Festen, also known in English as The Celebration, so this is your spoiler warning for all of that.
I choose this film since it's the first, most popular, and in my opinion the best of all the Dogma films, but also because, by and large, it sticks to the rules pretty stringently. To briefly summarise the film,
the patriarch of the family, Helge, is publicly accused by his son Christian of sexually abusing him and his now dead sister, after which denial, anger, and eventually acceptance take place within the family across the rest of the film.
One of the big debates surrounding Dogma 95 is just how serious, or contrarily just how unserious, it really is.
Beres Gout, a writer on aesthetics, has noted that it's easy to dismiss the Dogma manifesto as, he puts it, an exercise in irony. It's called the vow of chastity, it has 10 commandments, it opens with I swear, and it was all written in under an hour. So, yes, there's an element of self-awareness and playfulness in the manifesto. In fact, one word that keeps recurring, both in the statements of Vinterberg and von Trier, but also in the literature on the movement, is the word game. It revolves around rules, and bending those rules, and playing within those rules. Von Trier described his first experience with a camera as a good game.
I mentioned this question of whether or not Dogma is a serious movement, because certainly, a part of it is just that these rules provided a challenge for the filmmakers, a bit of fun in their movie-making process. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a very serious and ideological aspect to it as well.
Yeah, I get the impression from reading what Lars has said about it that there's a lot of satire behind the whole thing as well.
Yeah, but you know, that's just a way to cover yourself, isn't it?
I see.
It was meant quite seriously, and it was the most inspiring thing I've tried.
In the FAQ section on the old Dogma website, Vinterberg wrote that he wanted to counter or moderate certain tendencies in modern filmmaking. He wanted to counter the mediocrity and the conventional, that Dogma contains within it an inherent duplicity since, whilst jokingly written, it was written for a reason.
If one looks at the generally accepted functions of film music, to provide continuity, to establish tone and emotion, to establish setting, to help with pacing, and to help with characterization, then Dogma has an answer for all of these.
Setting doesn't need to be established, since Rule 7 prohibits temporal and geographical alienation. And if music is required to construct tone, emotion, pacing, characterization, and continuity, then it is a crutch used where storytelling and acting should be used instead. Vinterberg and von Trier weren't the first to take a dislike towards film music in this way. Stravinsky said in 1946 that the only real function of film music is to feed the composer. He said that when music attempts to explain, to narrate, or to underline something, the effect is both embarrassing and awful.
By the way, I don't think film scoring is bad. I actually think it's fantastic. That's why I've got videos about it on this channel. And I don't think the directors of Dogma films think film scoring is bad either. In fact, there's plenty of music in their subsequent films once they've moved on from the Dogma movement. Non-diegetic music was excluded from the Dogma films because it created restrictions for the directors and it put an increased emphasis on story and performance. But there's another reason too: realism.
And realism, and by the way, I'm talking about lowercase r realism here, is a bit overstated in discussions of Dogma. That being said, one of the fundamental reasons that there is no film scoring in Dogma films is because reality isn't supplemented with a soundtrack at the right moments.
Remember that Dogma doesn't actually ban music, it just stipulates that sound can't be produced apart from the image or vice versa.
Let's look at Feston to see why this matters. Just over half an hour into the 1 hour and 40-minute film, the main character, Christian, makes the first of his accusatory speeches towards his father. And where another film perhaps would include some kind of underscore, since emphasising the horrific qualities of the accusations might seem obvious, the absence of music means that the audience is not cheaply manipulated, and is left instead to decide for themselves what to focus on in the scene. The horror of the accusations, the awkwardness of the guests, or the little diegetic sound that there is. Little sounds of crockery, the cringe-inducing moment one guest treats it like an ordinary speech, coughs, and a little laughter. Music, even if perfectly chosen or composed, would stop the diegetic sound from standing out in this way, and impede the horrifically awkward silence.
If you're enjoying this video, please feel free to leave a like or leave a comment, because I always love hearing what you guys have to say about these videos. Also make sure to subscribe. If you're enjoying this video, you'll surely love some of the videos I've got coming up soon, so also make sure to turn notifications on.
So sure, film scoring isn't realistic, but nor's watching a film anyway. The viewer knows it's fiction, so who cares? The Dogma manifesto stipulates, in a short pledge at the end, that I swear as a director to refrain from personal taste. I'm no longer an artist. This ban on aesthetic consideration means that you can't have non-diegetic music, because it is inherently an aesthetic consideration. Of course, it's an aesthetic consideration to choose diegetic music too.
But if the character picks the music, it's different, because whilst the filmmakers have constructed a fictional world, they draw a very distinct line that everything within that world is then real.
Let's look back to Feston and see how this can be effective. There's a notable absence of music throughout the entire film. We don't hear any slivers of music until nearly half an hour in, and we don't hear anything else until nearly 50 minutes in. This is remarkably little music, to the point where its absence gives the film a certain starkness. To see a character making these aesthetic choices rather than the filmmaker, let's look at the second instance of music being heard, nearly 50 minutes into the film. This comes after Christian's second speech, in which he again accuses his father of a slew of abuses and obscenities, and then the gathering clears out of the dining hall. We see Michael, Christian's brother and the son of the accused, ask the pianist to play something.
Hey, spit on the hill then. Come on.
From a practical production perspective, this doesn't allow the filmmakers to rely on post-production. Since the music is all recorded together, live, they can't add anything or take anything away later on.
From a story perspective, Vinterberg the director has not chosen the music, Michael and the pianist have. It also gives the musician a character and points attention to the fact that it's diegetic music to function as non-diegetic music. The musician here is not alienated. The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself from the chains that shackle the spirit, so said Igor Stravinsky in his 1939 lecture, The Composition of Music. And this idea of creative limitation has been around since at least ancient Greece. Lars von Trier echoed this sentiment in 1999, saying that the whole idea behind the rules is that, in setting limits to freedom, we enhance freedom within circumscribed limits.
Because music isn't outright banned, if the directors do want to put music into their films, then they have to come up with more creative solutions to do so.
Like making Michael tell the pianist to play some music.
It makes more meticulous planning essential. A score or a voiceover can't be added later to save a scene that otherwise doesn't work. The story can't be patched up by the editors.
Vinterberg said that the absence of music made him
absolutely consequential emotionally when writing this. I thought, if I don't have any music, if I don't have anything, I have to keep an audience engaged with this story every second.
Every line of dialogue, every shot, everything done by the actors matters more as a result. This puts a bit more onus on the actors than in other films, freed from the constraints of performing to a larger crew or in a studio setting. It, in a sense, reverses the power between the cast and the crew, to a degree. The actors aren't performing to the camera, but the film is playing out in front of it.
Some have argued that this makes for better acting, and that's why you get a real intensity in the characters in the Dogma films. Now, this isn't only due to the lack of music. For example, the handheld camera really helps as well, but it's certainly a big part of it.
Rule 7, the here and now rule, Jan Simons argues, is also a demand that the action takes place in the here and now of the space in front of the camera lens and the sound operator's microphone.
This wouldn't be possible with non-diegetic music, since the microphone and the audio is conceptualised as solely following the actors, acting as pure documentation rather than anything aesthetic.
This is also why Dogma gets comparisons, and not wholly unfairly, to trying to mimic a documentary-style aesthetic. From a production standpoint, responses to Rule 2 have varied across films. Lars von Trier, talking about his film Idioterne, and by the way, forgive my Danish pronunciation throughout this, or The Idiots in English, called the rule a very interesting part of making the film, whereas Vibeke Windelov called it the most difficult part of making the films. The system was considered to be a nightmare for editors, since it meant that the picture had to be cut to accommodate the sound recording rather than any other way.
Even diegetic music, which is still permissible in the Dogma rules, is usually added in post-production, something that can't be done within the constraints of Dogma.
Looking at Festen, there's one other scene where the piano is played. Because the music is recorded live along the scene, this created a problem for the editor. She wanted to cut the scene a little shorter, meaning that they had to cut around the music, otherwise it would sound disjointed and odd. This was possible only because it isn't exactly a beautiful piece of music that's being played, it's more just aimless plonking of the piano keys, but it's still possible to hear jumps at the cuts. This goes back to the point earlier of not having the crutch of post-production being quite so easily accessible, and having to both plan adequately and live with the decisions made. These are relatively broad ways that the lack of music impacts the films, and whilst I've been using Festen to illustrate this, these same impacts can be felt across many of the Dogma films. But Rule 2 also impacts each of the films in individual ways, giving each one not only a unique character, but showing the breadth of impact that the restriction has. To talk still about Festen, Thomas Vinterberg said that the prohibition of a score resulted in the frequency of singing in the film.
No music meant a lot of singing, and a lot of musical moments appeared from that, from playing that game.
And this singing created what is probably the film's most iconic shot. And perhaps the most overt facade of normality, trying to retain a grip on the day where the reality of everything slowly is setting in. Another example comes just over an hour into the film, when the grandma sings I skovens dybe stille ro, or In the Deep Peaceful Forest, a traditional Danish folk song. Firstly, this provides a contrast with the interspersed shots of Christian returning to yet again accuse his father, but it also gives it a more national character. Vinterberg has acknowledged that the rule meant that more songs has to be woven into the script, and the choice of this Danish folk song allows for a greater national character to be expressed. Yes, a score could have woven in national themes, but in all likelihood it would have been more nationally generic or otherwise ambiguous. For a Danish audience especially, but still for an international audience, both this song and the previously discussed conga line scene, as Susan Antoinette Elgum and Suzanne Kemp put it, bring the party tradition and atmosphere closer to the audience.
most of the Dogma films weren't that well received, though some, like Festen and Idiotine, hold up today as unconventional, dark, and sometimes darkly funny pieces of cinema. Dogma 95 shouldn't convince you that film scoring is bad, but it isn't trying to. For its own reasons, it excludes non-diegetic music from its films, and that benefits the films made by Vinterberg, von Trier, and those who joined them in the movement. They certainly weren't on some kind of crusade against film composers. But what Dogma did was not only undercut the assumption that film scoring is a universally good thing by showing the benefits of its absence, but also by pushing against the expected standards of filmmaking at the time. Reactionary? Sure, but reactionary against a kind of art that Vinterberg and von Trier saw as the most conservative of all. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you did make it this far, then please again do consider subscribing. And if you enjoyed this video, on screen now is another video about film music that you'll surely also enjoy.